As we begin today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective. As you know, for this series now of 7 webinars, we've been basically tracking almost accidentally the history of the development of the principles in the world of education. Been very careful to say from day one that in fact, the very first work in education happened in Salt Springs, and we've already featured speakers from that period of time. They learned directly from Sid Banks, and we have moved over time with these presentations to many of us who learned, for example, primarily from Roger Mills or from others, and occasionally from Sid Banks. The trajectory of how education has been introduced to the principles over these many years, something like 45 years now, has in some ways followed the same changes that have occurred with the overall focus in teaching the principles broadly and globally. By that I mean in the early days, as Barb Ost, Krista Kamsel, and others talked about it, they had learned at a very young age directly from Sid Banks right there in Salt Spring. And it meant that they were living the principles and sharing the principles in their jobs, but not in official ways. And that's important because it meant that their focus was very much on the health of the helper, the spiritual awareness of the source of health, for example, or well-being, and the experience of wisdom on a very practical daily basis. So that, for example, it dramatically affected how Barb Ost functioned as a school administrator, and her book, The Essential Curriculum, which is written very recently to tell us the important lessons that she offers for how to be an administrator in the school with an understanding of the principles. That is grounded in that deep internal understanding of the principles that show up as a lived reality. And we also know that there was tremendous community. By that I mean there were individuals living in the Salt Spring community who were also learning at the same time. And that history has been recorded in a variety of ways, for example, by Jack Pransky in the Paradigm Shift History of the Principles. So it was a place where the principles were alive and well in that community of people. But when Krista and Marika and Barb and others were in their school work days, they essentially were alone. And that's important because by the time we get to today's speakers, the shift, and maybe I should say the ebb and flow in the development of the ways in which the principles have been shared with others has kind of gone up and down, which is natural with any growing body of knowledge. That shift, by the time I was learning, for example, in 1993, 95, and so on, had a very psychological tone to it. And there was a lot of value in that because in a public school setting, when we were doing systems work, which meant publicly grant-funded interventions into school systems such as St. Cloud, where Joel and Brady are from, we had to be, isn't it lucky today I'm dealing with a bronchial condition too? So this is the principles live. Um, that early era in 98 or thereabouts had a very strong psychological educational component, and that's explained in the history of the principles also. But at the same time, for example, in my own work, I was moving in the direction of being prepared to teach a spirituality and resilience course now for many, many years at my university. So some of us in that 90s period had a good footing on the spiritual, not just the psychological. And it would be honest for me to say that when I was first learning, I went for my work to the trainings with Roger Mills, and I wasn't thinking about me. And so I learned it in some ways in an intellectual way. And it was a way that made sense to go into communities like St. Cloud, where we had grants, to begin to teach the principles, or I should say, share the principles with large numbers of people for as much as 20 years, and blending the spiritual and the psychological in a way that would not be offensive in a public school system. Today, we won't be talking about the systems change as much as we'll be talking about the actual experiences that Brady and Joel have had as they've brought the principles into their work. And when I asked them to title this session, they quickly said they wanted to talk about empowering school staff members and students to access their inner health. I think that's significant, and it's different than what was maybe happening in a more informal way in the very earliest days of living the principles in schools there in Salt Spring. This was a concerted effort to begin to bring the principles to the system, despite all odds, we might say, and we'll talk about those in July. But I'm going to ask that Joel and Brady each introduce themselves, because you'll tell your stories better than I do. I know some things about these guys that I could share with you that are fun. There couldn't be two more different people who work together more beautifully as a team. And if I were to say that one is a musician and the other has been in the military, it probably begins to give you a sense of the difference between these two great men who together have more than 50 years in education. And it's interesting, I just noticed here as we started that Brady was first introduced about 1997, when I was just early beginning to teach or share the principles. And Joel came along a little bit later, 2005. So we've gotten some of the bugs out of it, and he has an advanced degree, school psychologist, between PhD and master's, was able to just take to it quickly. So I'm going to turn this over to Joel and Brady and ask you to introduce yourselves and get us going, if you will.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathy. Brady and I drew straws, and I ended up with a short one, so I get to go first. So I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of my background and how I came to be exposed to the principles. And first of all, I've been a school psychologist now for 30 years, and I've been in the St. Cloud district here for 28 of those years. And back in the 90s, I had heard that health realization training was happening in our district. We, at that time, and kind of since then too, we've always kind of described it as health realization. And I know that people now simply refer to it as the principles. But so when you hear me use those terms, you'll know that it's basically interchangeable. And so I was not on the list of people who got the training in the 90s. But then luckily, the training came back into our district, and after a period of years, was offered again, and I was lucky enough to be able to attend at that time. And Kathy and I think Gary Johnson were the facilitators when I first was exposed to the principles. And I have to tell you that it was just one of the finest trainings that I've been involved with. And those of you who are in education, you know that in addition to getting your training before you start work, then there's lots of in-service training that's required and workshops and so on over the years. And when I learned about the principles, I was kind of surprised that I had never learned about this previously with all the training and all the workshops that I had had. So I really became very passionate about wanting to share that information. And luckily, I've been able to share it with some of my colleagues in school psychology, and certainly with other school staff from a variety of different specialties and occupations. So after my initial training, I was lucky enough to participate in some advanced trainings that we had in our district, which were more focused then on the application of teaching the principles to students. The initial training was kind of for us to learn the principles and for us to really begin to see the impact of understanding those principles in our own lives. In other words, for us to be able to access our own health before we attempted to go out and share that with students. And through the advanced trainings, we started to move toward coming up with ideas of how we would approach the idea of sharing the principles with students. And that was something that I think many of the people who were trained at that time were really having questions about, because everyone was excited after being trained and they were saying, how do we get this? How do we share this with students? And so that became what we looked at with our advanced trainings. And then as we went along with this, we got to the point of having kind of leader trainings for those of us who were really very interested and very supportive of continuing to move forward with keeping the principles as a major focus of what we wanted to happen in our school district. So since that time, Brady and myself and Susan Hill, whom you may have seen on an earlier recorded session, have done some trainings following the trainings that Kathy had presented in our district. And in addition to that, I've had an opportunity to do some trainings with staff in other areas. I did some parent trainings that I can talk about a little bit, but primarily my work has been with students. Although in my current role, those of you who are school psychologists out there listening might understand that we don't get a lot of time to do direct work with students in many of our roles, unfortunately. But for those who do, and for those of us who have some opportunities to do that sort of direct work, I found it to be just something that I really love to share with students. And so that's kind of my background up to this point, and I want to let Brady give a chance to introduce himself as well.
Certainly. It's interesting. We go back to 97, and as Kathy mentioned, that was my first exposure to that. That was also the same year that I was hired with the school district. Prior to that, I had worked at the St. Cloud Children's Home as a therapist, which is actually where we're broadcasting today. I was a clinician at the children's home, and the district kind of recruited me away and said, we really would like to have your skill set at one of the local high schools there. And I accepted the position, and within about a month, Dr. Dick Holt, the director of special education for the district, said, "Brady, I really want you to attend this training, and I want you to bring it to Apollo," which was the high school that I worked at. And as Kathy mentioned, she was just getting up and running in the district. Maybe she was teaching just for a few years at that point, but he was real excited about it, and he saw me as the vehicle to bring it to the school. And I attended the training, and as I left, it was a fine training. You got a lot of little nuggets. There's a lot of things you already know. So you go to these trainings and you're like, okay, where's this nugget? What makes this so special? And I was completely blinded by my own education because I saw everything from a medical model. I had just graduated with my master's degree in child psychology and human development, and I'm looking for a diagnosis. I'm seeing kids from attention deficit to conduct disorder, oppositional defiant, and there's a label. I mean, that kind of drives the business of providing services. And as Kathy talked, she made it sound pretty fluid, and it almost sounded non-clinical. And so I really struggled with, how can I teach something that I just spent all this time and money on learning how to be a child psychology background and now clinical social worker. And it took me about 4 times attending this. Okay, so I went the first year, I walked away. What's that, Kathy?
Can I interrupt you a second?
Sure.
You did come to the 4-day trainings a few times yeah, you're right. It took a while. But I remember you being very angry one day when you kind of, your hand hit your forehead and you said, "Oh my gosh, the woman down the street could teach this." And the assumption was, what am I supposed to do with my degrees? You have 2 master's degrees. You worked really hard. And then it flowed from there. But you were patient. You kept coming and coming. Why?
Well, because Dr. Dick Holt had said, "I want you to bring this to the district." And I wasn't sure, I couldn't wrap my hands around what it was. And so as I attended those trainings over the several years that I attended, I'm really at a personal understanding level, learning the principles. And I did have that aha moment that Kathy just described, because what she was really teaching was very simple, that we all have it. We just don't all access it because we're not always aware. Unless somebody points us in that direction, we're not aware we have it. And so that was probably the day that I took, and in behind me, in this cupboard behind me here, are all my DSMs and the statistical manuals and the different ways to do diagnosis. And they've probably been in there, and I hardly ever take them out anymore because I don't need them. That's not how I approach students. So fortunately, I did have that aha, and I knew what to do. And I had a principal back in the 90s, Pat Mullen, who said, "Brady, I have these students that are constantly coming to the office for behavior issues, attendance issues, and I really don't want them in the office that much anymore. So I want you to do a group or do something." And I had said, "Absolutely." And I went into their classrooms. These were students that are diagnosed. They are on individual education plan, special education services in the district. And I taught the principals to the classroom and took some measures. And we had the historical data of all their attendance and their behavior prior to the intervention that I did in the classrooms. And then we had the post data, which showed one student never went to the office again over months for skipping class. I'm sorry, for behavior issues. And the rest, all of them went down and reduced their overall behaviors, which really demonstrated to Pat Mullen that I should teach this again. So then I taught it in other EBD rooms and to other students under SLD. And my big win was when I had students just come into my office and they had heard there was something going on, and would introduce students to the principals, and I would have teachers bring the students. If there's somebody that I could bring to you, when a student's crying in the classroom, if I could take you to someone that would help, would you let me take them? And they would bring them to my office and drop off this child that's struggling. actually it's a high school student, so it's not even a child, a teenager that's struggling, and they would leave. And the student was grateful and would go back and tell the teacher, thank you so much for introducing them to Brady and so forth. So I had learned it myself. I had started to teach it, and I also had young children of my own at that point, 3 girls. And, you know, Kathy had alluded to my military background. I've been in the military. I've since retired, but spent about 26 years in, and been deployed on the in the war zone, and spent a lot of time here in the States doing different things. And you know, if you can imagine for a moment military, there's a time when people really struggle with how can you be in the military, an infantry officer, and be a social worker? Because social workers are supposed to be gentle, very calming, very very question-oriented and supportive. And military infantry officers are direct, they're commanding, they're this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. And when you raise your own family, there's a propensity, and my dad had been in the military also, as both my brothers have been. And when dad speaks and says, this is the way it's going to be, there's a propensity for that to be a familial thing where it just continues from generation to generation. But I had, those girls were little at that time. They've since graduated from high school. But when you take these principles home and you realize that we all have access to this wisdom, all of us have this common sense, and you start to see the emotional nature of raising girls, you start to realize that they're in that same, they have access to that same wisdom and health that I do, and that I had spent so much time trying to learn from attending these trainings with Kathy, that you can now sit down and see them with empathy. You can empathize with the struggles that they have. And so I became a calmer parent. I became a parent that was a better listener. I became a better dad. And the neat thing about it is that my girls today are replicating. They've all learned these principles from me. And one of them goes out and teaches it to her friends in the classroom and in the hallway when they're struggling. And so we have this next generation of the principles taking place as she actually goes to school. And she's brought some girls over to my house and said, Dad, will you talk to her about this? And I have to be careful about that. But the fact that my children are bringing kids to me or teaching them themselves really lends the power of how this is innate, that this is within all of us. And, you know, in the military, and there may be an opportunity here in a little bit too, but I've also had the opportunity to teach this in a military setting. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to go to Iraq here a few years ago, and while over there, approached the commanding general. I actually worked for him. I was just down the hall from him, and we ran the entire southern half of Iraq, all the provinces and our area of operation. And I told him we were having some suicide issues and so forth from the soldiers out in the field, and I had said there is this thing I would like to teach, and he wanted some information and so forth, and Kathy and I communicated with one another, and she got me some resources and so forth over there, and I was able to teach soldiers on the ground from a variety of backgrounds the principles. And when you can be in the combat zone and be calm and not get rattled, what a gift that is when you can recognize that your thinking is what's actually rattling you. So, you know, it's really been just an absolute blessing to have been given the opportunity to learn this to my own life, the opportunity to share it with others. And I no longer look for the medical model reason why the child is struggling. I just now know that they're not in their health, that they're, you know, many of you are probably familiar with the chairs, but they're not in their chair 1 or chair 2, they're in chair 3 or 4. And so if you approach them with empathy and understanding, they'll tend to calm. And then when they calm a little bit, you can point them towards the principles and you can do some individual teaching. And lo and behold, they walk away going, I never knew that. I've been seeing therapists and counselors for years, and you put it all together for me. And within a few sessions, these kids are leaving treatment. Give you a real quick background on the facility here. The St. Cloud Children's Home is a program offered by Catholic Charities here in St. Cloud. We are in an very, very old structure, children's home representing a structure that's probably 140 years old, where the orphans from the east would come and stay when they would get off the trains, and they were put to work in the fields and so forth here. Well, it's since been transformed into a residential treatment facility, and we have about 50 students that live here and go to school here, and they work on their mental health, and some of them are referred for reasons for criminal activity, for mental health issues, for suicide. We have secure and unsecure. So we've got a program with 16 students that can't leave. Their risk to themselves or others is so high that they need to be contained, locked in, and they receive all the clinical services and education inside there. But it's all state of the art. It's all bringing all these opportunities together. We also have students from our own district that come for behavioral issues. They're struggling in our mainstream buildings where they're not able to be in a mainstream building because of the difficulties that they create for themselves and others. And then we also have students from the surrounding districts and our district, that students who have brought guns to school, just have some significant mental health issues. And one of the ways to bend that mental health is to let them do something called day treatment, and where they receive 3 hours of clinical, individual, family, and group work, and then 4 hours of education where they get their academics. We have about 17 teachers that teach here. We have very small classrooms. And so that's where we're broadcasting today, and that's where I'm a school social worker at. But when you take these kids that all have this mental health or these struggles, and you point them into the direction of the principals, it's been absolutely amazing how many of them start to find their health, and they're able to discharge or start to not need as many services as they previously had. They can go off their medication, because once you point them to the health of the principals, their innate health takes over, and they become much better. So it's...
Brady, a couple of things come to mind for me. When I first started coming into St. Cloud, which was 96, I believe, it was very common for me as an outsider to hear staff in the mainstream buildings, and I think at that time you had something like, is it 16 school buildings in the district?
Sounds reasonable. About 10,000 students.
Yeah, it was real ordinary to hear someone in either a meeting or in the hall saying that they were trying to get a, quote, problem student referred out over to what is now Riverwoods, the school that you're talking about. And of course, there's the residential component too. And it was always as if in the mainstream schools, if we can just remove those children, then things will be better. And it's been interesting over the years to hear stories from both of you about how some children have gone out of building, of course, and then returned. And Susan Hill was a part of this series not long ago, and she talked about some very high-risk individual students. In fact, one who ended up completing she's in college, and that would not have been thought to be possible at that time. Another thing that I remember about that rather early period, once you got in the swing of feeling that you were confident to share the principles with students in ways that made sense to you. Everyone has to do it their own way. I remember, coming in and saying to all of you in the advanced leader group, you've got to start documenting your results. It doesn't matter that you day to day go and teach the principals. What we're after is having a long-term impact on the system. And that plan that you developed with Principal Pat Mullen was actually a turning point in the district. And I'd like for people in the audience to hear this one part of it, because sometimes when we talk about evaluation, especially in the three principles global community, we go way over the deep end and start thinking about rigorous research, which is not realistic in most of our cases. And what made a difference in St. Cloud was the day that you yourself, Brady, said, I will pick 4 students. And you worked with them individually in your role as a school social worker to teach them the principles as they came to you, either by their own choice or a set of appointments. It was not uncommon that I might be there doing a meeting with you and a student would come around the door and I would need to leave, and you would, put that student on one of those old plaid couches and you'd sit there and you'd talk. But what I love about the example here is what Pat Mullen did once he heard you saying what happened to those 4 students. As I recall, and you were strong, you said, that you were willing to do more of this with more students. You remember that negotiation with him? You want to talk about that?
I can. What was interesting, and that's exciting to talk about, is that those 4 students were those problem students that he didn't want to see in the office. And so I worked with them individually and in group and taught them the principles. And as I mentioned earlier, the number of support referrals, their attendance issues all decreased significantly. Some where they were not having any issues anymore because they were tapping into their own state of mind and resilience and using the principles. Pat Mullen liked the data so much that I said, if you want more of this, you're going to need to dedicate some of my time to bring this to students. And what he did is he freed me up from doing some other things that fall within the school social work realm and said, you no longer have to do those. I want you to spend more time doing this. So he took a step, and Kathy was right. I mean, principals are not known for taking something off your plate in exchange for doing something else. They tend to say, and I need you to do this. And so when he was willing to invest, and I told him, I said, I can't do this and do all the other things I'm doing and do it well. And I don't remember the percentage of my time. I don't know if it was 20% of my day, a day a week I had to do health realization or teach the principles. And it freed me up to be able to meet kids where they were in the hallway, kids in crisis, bring them to my office. It gave me the opportunity to spend time going into the EBD classrooms and the SLD classrooms and doing some groups and so forth. So his investment was, whether it's self-motivated because he wanted to see fewer kids in trouble or in his office, the fact that he empowered me to then go out and teach it and then actually bring the results by those students having less interactions, less difficulties. It was a win-win for the students, the administration, and it was an opportunity for me to teach what I believe in. So,
yes, and as I remember, I mean, it's really important. One, we're talking about the staff person who understands the principles and has success with students needing to negotiate with a heavy-duty administrator about changing your workload. That's hard. And in order to do that, the staff person has to be really confident that you've got some numbers that make sense to that administrator. And as I recall, because I kept pressing everybody, you've got to have your own little evaluation plan. You picked just 4 things that you were going to assess about the students, about those 4 students. And I think I remember them being attendance in school, which is, that's kept by the system. You didn't have to create that record. You just look it up. Grades and calls to the office. And I'm not sure what the other one was, but it was very simple, but very important basic educational data on those 4 kids. Now, mind you, in a school system of 10,000, we normally in the principals community would say following 4 kids can't make a difference. But it does. It does. We have to be very realistic about evaluation. And at this point, I'm going to come back over to Joel and ask you to talk about whatever points you wish, but what you have seen and done with students, how you feel about the principles as a part of teacher preparation, whatever direction you plan to go. And I'm going to step back again.
Well, there's a number of things there that I can comment on, but just to tie back into what Brady had just mentioned about the role that you're in and needing to have some time dedicated to be able to have the opportunity to work with students directly to share this information was, it kind of triggered a memory in me that about that same time that I first learned of the principles, our district also was starting an early intervention initiative where we were really moving towards doing interventions for students in a very scientific, very fidelity, trying to really impact them before we just moved right into a special ed referral and trying to break down that dichotomy of general ed versus regular ed and to give students options in between for those students who typically fell through the cracks. So anyway, in this process of moving towards early intervention, I did have part of my time that was dedicated to helping to facilitate this process and to get it up and running in our buildings, the buildings that I was in. So as a part of that, I had, like about a day or a day and a half, a week, whatever it was, that I could use for intervention support. And so as much of that time as I could, I used in working directly with students. And luckily, I had a principal in an elementary school that I worked in at that time who hadn't actually had the training herself, but had somehow knew enough about it, or maybe gathered enough about it from other staff who had learned the principles, that she saw the value in it, and she started to kind of bring students to me, sort of bring them to my office and say, here's a student, and kind of explain why she was bringing them to me, and said, I think that maybe they would benefit by learning something about health realization. So those were some of the earlier experiences that I had of starting to share my understanding of the principles with students. And fairly early on with that, one specific example really is a story that I'd like to share with you all, because it really demonstrates that with certain individuals, helping them to understand how these principles are operating in their lives to create their daily experiences can be profoundly impactful, and it can be very quick to see the impact of that. And so this example was a young man that I think was about a 4th or 5th grader at the time. And the principal brought him to me because he was starting to miss school. And when he did come to school, he was so anxious that he would actually physically go to the nurse's office and be throwing up. And prior to this, he had been a good student. He was a pretty bright young man. And so I met with him, I think, for about maybe 2 to 3 times, and kind of described to him how our thinking creates our feelings, and how our feelings kind of flow from the thoughts that we kind of pay attention to and that we hold on to. And we talked about how we all have this natural wisdom inside of us that helps us to do well, no matter what situation we're in. And of course, told them about how we have this ability to notice or to be aware of what thoughts we have going on and what we're doing with our thoughts. And so through the process of teaching him this, it came to the point where he was not getting physically sick, and he wasn't missing school anymore. And he was kind of back to his usual self again. And the thing that I most enjoyed about this young man, though, is that each time I'd see him in the halls, and this happened over a period of years, and in fact, it's still happening today. I think he probably is graduating from high school this year. And I've seen him at his job around town, and every time I see him, he says, you know, Mr. Selensky, that stuff that you taught me really does help. And so he says, you know, now I'm in a band, and I'm not afraid to be up on stage. I don't have that anxiety anymore. And it was just amazing to me that just through meeting with him and helping him to understand these principles in his own life in such a short amount of time, that he was able to experience that kind of benefit from it. And certainly not all students will do that. I can share other stories with you of other students who struggle not to learn the principles, not to understand them, but they struggle to apply that in their lives. But this is such a nice example of someone who saw immediate benefit, and it's been persistent over the course of time. And really, he has had very little exposure to these principles other than just a few short sessions.
If you added it up, how many hours do you think you spent with that student?
I would say probably less than an hour and a half.
Oh my word.
Mm-hmm. But again, he was one that he just understood. He understood when I was teaching these principles about how our thoughts work and how our bodies kind of feel our thoughts as an emotion, just like we can notice our thoughts in our mind as a intellectual, you know, if you ask someone what you're thinking, they can go in and focus and notice and tell you that. But we also notice the thought as an emotion, as a feeling. And I think that once he understood that the anxiety was not coming from school or what was happening around him, and that it was just coming from thoughts, he was able to put those thoughts aside, which is one of the things that I've seen with other students that is difficult, is that ability to apply it and realize, okay, I don't have to continue to stay in this pattern or this habit of thinking that I have, and that I have options. And even though they understand the principles, for some students, it's hard in the moment when they're feeling those intense emotions. It becomes very difficult for them to go back in, to slow down, to kind of calm down, calm the mind, and start to notice and access that natural, innate wisdom that can help them to say, okay, there's that same pattern that I keep getting stuck in that's causing me issues.
What do you say to students, or how do you help them experience the quiet mind, or the spiritual health within, innate health, however you know, whatever words you use, but that part of us that's always just fine?
Mm-hmm.
You come across some students who live very difficult lives, very young students even.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You know, there's a variety of ways that I've done that, and I know Brady has a couple of wonderful examples. He just showed me another one today that hopefully he'll share with you here that I thought was awesome. But it's just a matter of finding different ways, sometimes just using analogies. For example, one analogy that seems to work well with a lot of people is kind of the analogy of what a lake looks like when there's no wind. And the surface of the lake is very calm, and it's very still, and it's almost like glass, and you can see all the reflections, and it's just total peacefulness. In contrast to the days when there's strong winds and the white caps are going and the winds are pushing the waves and everything is really getting all tossed and worked up. And I found even little second graders understand that kind of a concept of the same thing that can happen with your thinking. I had a beautiful example of how a little second grade girl understood this, because she gave me back another analogy, which was really pretty cute. She said, you know, it's kind of like changing oil in your car. And I said, really? I said, that's interesting. Now, tell me about that. And she says, well, my dad says, you know, like when the oil in your car gets old and dirty, it can be damaging to your car. So you let that out and you put in new fresh oil, and then it helps your motor to run well. So what a perfect example of her showing me how she understood this idea that our thinking can work in that same way as being beneficial and helpful or being damaging to us.
You know, she could have sat with Sid Beggs and had a lovely conversation, and he would have said, oh, that's the way it works with old stale wine too. You got to just dump it out. Lovely. I'm going to unmute our special discussant, Sue, and invite you in a little bit when you're ready to simply jump into the conversation if you would like. Is there something that has popped into your mind, Sue, that you might like to mention or point out or question?
Well, I love hearing the stories, and I think they're so powerful for anybody to hear. And it's so true about sometimes. Well, I've had a situation where a child doesn't hear anything, and a situation where over a number of weeks they've got onto it, and then they begin to see it in their life, and then in other cases where it's so quick. And I think what's really important is not to have an expectation. And it occurs to me that it's really important to see that this is a mutual experience. This is we're both on the same side and we're both learners. And I've come to see that much more clearly, that I don't have any, well, I don't have the answers. I don't have many answers at all. I can listen and an idea might come to me, you know, and this is how we proceed. So I think that what's fundamental, I think in every case, whether you're looking at someone who's really, really latching on quickly or somebody who is very busily mapping it onto what they already know, is that if you can just be within yourself, the open channel, then that just maximizes the possibility and opens the way for potential. And really, I think over the years, I see that I do less and less and less. And I've got quieter and quieter, almost to the point that if you said, well, you know, what do you do? It would be harder to recite what I do. And yet, when you start going into individual stories, then you can sort of see, well, we started like this, and then we moved over here and we did that. But it's not like that becomes a template. So what I love about this is that it is, and it's so important that it is new and fresh, and it's about you in that moment and the child in that moment. And that's not a get-out clause. It just seems to me fundamentally important. So I've loved hearing. I think that's what I've been hearing from you.
Thank you, Sue. And one thing you just mentioned that I want to key in on is that you said when you're working with a student, we're both on the same side. And that is such a key thing that I love about teaching the principles to students, is that you're kind of empowering them and you're accepting them where they're at, and you're just trying to guide them towards their health. And like you said, some of them recognize it quickly, and it's dramatic and it's amazing. And then others struggle to find that. But just knowing that you are on their side and that you are pointing them towards their health. You know, sometimes in education, we know this, that sometimes you plant the seed and you never really are sure if that seed will actually take hold and produce, or it might happen. It might happen years from now, and we don't know that. So I think it's always important to just understand that it's a hopeful thing because we're empowering people. And I know in my own life, there were many times where I was taught things, and maybe in some level I understood it, but then somewhere down the road, I had one of those jumps where all of a sudden I understood it at a different level, and it really started to be beneficial to me now, because now I got it. Whereas before I was carrying it around and it wasn't really impacting me because I didn't really get it. And so, once we give students the information that they need to understand how their thinking is working and that they have this natural wisdom within them, they don't have to search for it or somehow have to get fixed. It's already there. It's just a matter of uncovering it and letting it be there and letting them access it. And it's such a wonderful way to work, even with very, very difficult students. Another example I have is I had a young man who was an 8th grader, and he was in special education for emotional and behavioral needs. And really, his life has been on a pretty difficult downward trajectory in many ways, legally and so on as well. And when I first started to work with him and started to teach him some of the principles, and I said to him, I'm going to share something with you that really is simple. You only have to remember 3 things. It's really quite simple, but it's amazing how beneficial it can be in your life. And as I was kind of giving him some of the background and giving him some of the information, he says to me, I want to learn about this. And I thought, that's so neat, because so many of these students like him are so disengaged, and they are they're discouraged, and they're kind of not realizing that their thinking is really self-destructing them in many, many ways. And by helping them to understand that they have options right within them right now, independent of what's happening in their families or their neighborhoods or what's happened in their parents' lives, that they have that innate health that they can tap into anytime they need to.
Well, that just touches my heart so much today, because I'm thinking of a little example of an assistant, a principal actually, and in a couple of minutes I'm going to ask Marika if you would comment also. But what I remember is that this particular principal had learned the principles and was living them in her own life, and was very hesitant to think that she could present or speak to her staff about that. Just didn't have the confidence maybe yet. But on a particular day, she had the secondary version of the student that you're talking about sitting in her office. And she always kept that beautiful yellow laminated poster by Mavis Karn. It's called The Secret, but it's about the principles. And you remember this principle, you remember the poster, you guys arranged the printing actually. But I remember her saying that this very troubled high school student was in her office for discipline and all kinds of things. And she took down the poster, put it in his hands, and asked him to read it out loud to her. And you remember that beginning sentence says, there's a secret, and nobody meant to keep it from you, but you are absolutely perfect. And then he went on paragraph by paragraph. and it became more and more difficult for him to read. And pretty soon the tears were dripping down. And at that moment, the principal and the student were married, emotionally married, to the possibility of hope in that young man's life. And that principal, who was so hesitant to speak publicly to her staff about the principles, lacking confidence to do it, was absolutely certain that this simple way of reaching this student was going to work. She did it time after time after time. So, Marika, I might ask you to join the conversation, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm very humbled by your stories. You know, I love the way you're pointing students to what's already inside them. And in my work, that's all I can do is see that innate beauty, that innate wisdom, and point students to it in whatever capacity my role at the time allows, right? But just being aware that it's there is such a help for working with other educators and working with students. It gives me the confidence. It gives the students the confidence when someone knows that you're already okay, regardless of what your concern is. You know, I have a lot of students coming to me who are very anxious about their futures. I'm a career advisor in a high school. So when I look in their eyes and I tell them, I know exactly you're going to be fine. And, you know, I'll give you some tips to find, you know, the answers you're looking for, but you know already that you're going to be fine. They walk out of the room with lighter feet, with a smile on their faces and confidence to face it. It's just that knowing it's already there, which all of you have talked about. I just love your stories and how you have shared that with people. I'm really touched by it, so thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I'd like to share, and it really works with, it piggybacks off what both of you have just shared, but there's, you know, it's that innate health we're talking about. It's that wisdom. This is a lighter. And one of the things that I do, and this is also going to answer a question that Kathy asked Joel a moment ago, is how do you get them to recognize that there's been this shift? And so as I tend to meet students when they're in crisis, and coming into my office gives us an opportunity to have some quiet and an opportunity to calm down. And for those of you who've seen it, the 5 chairs, I explain kind of what this means just briefly, and they're like, I'm in chair 4. I'm busy, I'm struggling, and I'm angry, and so forth. And then I one of the things that I do is and this is not the first thing that I would do, but I would talk to them about thinking, and I would introduce the concept of thought, and all the while I'm watching them get calmer as they start to understand that they understand how thought is impacting their life in that moment, because they're feeling angry, they're feeling anxious, they're feeling sad. And as we talk, they start to shift out of chair 4 into chair 3 into chair 2, and they become calmer. And I'll ask them, what chair are you in now? And they'll go, I'm in this chair. And I'll go, how did you get there? And they'll go, well, my thinking is different. And so, okay, so you've had this experience of exactly the principles in action, because you were ready to hit this student, but now you're not. And you're calmer. And where would you rather be? Do you like being in chair 4 or 5, or do you like being in chair 1 or 2? I've yet to meet a person ever that says, I really like chair 4 or 5. And so as they shift, they get a chance to notice while they're in my office how they're shifting. And then when they do walk out with lighter feet or feeling better about themselves, they're getting a chance to see it in action, and they recognize at that moment there's no denying it. They can't ever not deny that it was only their thinking that changed. Nothing else changed. One of the little analogies I do, and this was the one that Joe was referencing a couple of moments ago, but I take this lighter and I light it, and I'm like, that's a spark. And I say, when you were born, a spark started and a flame started inside of you, and it glows every day. It's the same spark light that grows in me. This is mine, this is yours, okay? And it just glows and it lights up the room. And as a very baby, you don't have anything negative. There's nothing wrong in your life. You're whole, healthy, and you've got access to your common sense and your wisdom. And, as you age, you still have access to this common sense and wisdom and this innate health, but it starts to get clouded a little bit by our thinking, okay? And we start to create these habits where we respond to things this way all the time. And we know that way, at least I'm safe. If I respond in anger, that teacher's not going to talk to me anymore, or will leave me alone, or won't expect me to do much work if I respond in anger. Well, in many ways, they're absolutely right. That's that they don't want to do the work, or whatever the issue is. They're angry with a person. That habit of thinking is starting to cover up their wisdom and their common sense, because they start to lose access that there could be another way. And so the analogy that I do is I take a coffee cup off of my desk, and this is just a standard coffee cup, and I go, if we were to turn off all the lights in the room and make it absolutely, totally dark, no light whatsoever, and light this light, that's you in this room. You have one light. And if we sat for a moment, could we start to see what's going on in this room? One candle over a few minutes would light this whole room up to where we would feel, okay, we know what's in here. We're safe, we're secure, we have access to our common sense and our wisdom. I know what to do if something were to happen. It's just this one little light in this big room that we're in. In fact, if I took this light and I walked around the room, I could probably read books. I could see what's going on over in the corner. If there's a noise, I could keep myself safe just by looking and using my own access to this wisdom. And as I talk to them, I'm like, you're a whole healthy being. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. And I explain to them there's lots of labels and things we place on students, but all that does is make you broken. You are already a whole healthy person. You have access to your common sense and your wisdom. And I talk about how their thinking is like a lampshade. And if I bring this lampshade over the top of this light, what tends to happen to the light? Do you lose access to all the things that you could see a moment ago? You can't see as well. And as I bring this lampshade down over the top of this light, at some point in time, you can only see what's below the cup or below the lampshade, maybe what's around your feet. And now you hear a noise or something happens over there or somebody yells something to you. You become afraid because you can't see them. You can't see that it's just a wind blowing against the window and the tree was tapping the glass. You think somebody's trying to break in because you don't have access to your wisdom as much. It's right here. And as you bring this cup down, you start to lose all your ability to see and find your way. And what happens is this cup is very much like the 5 chairs, because as I bring it down, if I were to bring this cup just even a little bit, the light never went out. The light is always the same light. But as I bring this cup all the way down, almost close to the bottom of the table, that's a person who's getting ready to enter chair 5. And that's where I really get concerned, because you're suicidal, you're homicidal, you're very dangerous to yourself or others. And the light is still glowing. Nothing's changed except for your thinking. And if I drop this cup down, what happens to the light? It goes out. And that's the biggest fear is that don't ever let your thinking consume you so much to where you actually believe that the only way out is to harm yourself or to jump off this bridge or to do something, because once you take the light out, it won't go back on. And they start to realize that if we just lift the cup, we realize that, and it's not the cup, but if we pay attention to our thinking and realize that our thinking has held us in this dark place, this is what keeps us broken. But we're a whole healthy person. We have access to all this light. I taught these principles to a girl several years ago who was probably one of the most depressed girls. She was a resident here in the facility. She had attempted suicide several times, and her name was Rayla. I'll just give you her first name. And she spent probably 3.5 to 4 hours with me total over a month. The first day, she was laying on the floor. A teacher came and said, "Brady, could you spend some time with her? She looks like she's in trouble." Well, she was laying on the floor in the hallway of the school with the sun coming through the light in an late September morning, and she looked like a Persian cat. And I went and sat down next to her, and fortunately she was able to come to my office with me. I introduced these principles to her. She shifted from being in chair 4 or 5 to chair 2, and she left feeling better about herself. She spent some time thinking about it. She asked to see me again. I furthered the discussion with her, maybe just another 45 minutes. And now she's really waking up to the principles. She's been getting therapy for years. And she goes, I have never known this before. I have never seen myself as a whole healthy person. My thinking is what's been clouding my life. And to the point where I'm wanting to hurt myself and lose my family and all the things that I love. And she, over the course of the next months, wants to teach it to the other girls in her unit, because they're struggling too. And she's got this gift that she wants to share. And so she's looking for tools. She wants a copy of my papers to come show them. And you know, we eventually brought her to one of our trainings to let her speak to what her wisdom and common sense, and she spoke to 30 or 40 adults in our county and our schools about what she learned in those 3 or 4 days where she spent just an hour with me each time. It changed her life. And I had her back half a year later, and she went and spoke to the county. I had her down at Stearns County, one of our county buildings, and she spoke to probation officers, judges, social workers about what she had learned. And
Wow.
This isn't the DSM. It isn't all this medical model. We all have access to this wisdom. We have it every day, and we just need to point children to their health. You know, I have lots of little stories. I would love to. You know, I think it might be fun someday to just have a story webcast where we talk about how we share these principles and what are some of the different tools and ways. Joel had never seen this one before. I've done it for years. One that he asked me about was
Joel and Brady.
One that I do also that very much like the light. I have a bucket full of coins. They're all different values. And I asked the student to hold on to that. Joel used to do this with me, all right? And I said, just reach in there without looking and pull out a coin. And I asked them, and they look at it, and I said, do you want to keep it or do you want to throw it back? What do you want to do?
I would throw it back.
He's going to throw it back. And I asked him to do it again. And this time he pulls out a quarter, and I said, do you want to keep it or do you want to throw it back?
So I would keep it.
So go ahead and set that on the table. And I asked him to do it again. And I have him do it about 9 times. And I've got dollars in here. I've got quarters, dimes, pennies, and nickels. And all of a sudden what tends to happen, and it has never changed, they always tend to hold the ones that are more valuable. They keep those. And I ask them, why did you throw the rest back and keep those? And they say, because these have value. And I'm like, that's a lot like our thinking. You have 60,000 thoughts a day, and you hold on to the ones that have value. Sometimes it's positive value, sometimes it's negative value, sometimes it's hurtful value or sad value, but you hold on to it, and you tend to, this is what you put in your pocket. This is what you walk around with all day. But how did you get rid of the other 60,000 coins in that bucket? Or there's 60,000 thoughts in a day. And they go, no, I just let them go. And I'm like, well, if this one's harmful to you, why don't you just put it back in the bucket and let it go? Why do you have to hold on to it? And it gets them to start thinking about how they hold on to a thought because it has value to them. And those are just a couple of small analogies that really resonate with the students that I work with, and I think probably would with many students.
Brady, I remember Rayla talking about the coin that she kept.
Mm-hmm.
And how really important that was to her, so that when she knew she would be released and able to leave the facility and go back to her home, that coin was going with her. So sometimes, just plain ordinary teaching skills come into this. It's an effective activity, but your understanding and belief in the student's health is what really awakened the spirit within. It's time to invite participants in the webinar to raise your hands. You know how to do that. And if I don't hear from you, if I don't see a hand go up, I will call on a couple of people along the way here. So I think I'm headed, I don't see a hand going up, but Lori Smith, school administrator from another state, I might ask you to make some comments. What are you noticing? What's coming to mind today?
Well, I think every time I listen to the webinar, and it happened again today, I just remind myself of all the resources that I have and that I need to remember to use. Sometimes, you know, in our busy day, we just slip into habit, get in autopilot, and I just have to remember to focus on being fully present, and all of that common sense that I know that I have, but also all this understanding about resilience, health realization, and the three principles is accessible. And, you know, sometimes I'm a little embarrassed about how I underutilize it. So every day I try and make a promise to myself that I'm going to apply it when I can as best I can.
I think your statement is so important. As a school administrator, you're no different than any other human being. We're in and out of our peace of mind, and the goal is to be present. So often we would find a whole variety of words by principals, teachers that referred to being present the way Sid Banks meant it, connected to that spiritual, whole, innate health, listening without judgment to another person, that pure health that is beyond our thinking, being present with us. So thank you very much. I'm wondering if Joe Waller, I see Gary Johnson has a question, and we will go to him. Gary, please make your comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it's wonderful the implications and the effects of a system learning this together. Joel and I worked together in St. Cloud for a long time, and prior to me moving to Wisconsin, and that so we both sort of had the opportunity within our systems to learn these principles, and as I know, the personal understanding is what's so powerful, and the rippling effect within our institutions that we work in, and but it's also neat to have the friendship that we've had for all these years to be deepened, just because we have this understanding that helps us connect even in new ways that are even better than the past. So for
those of you that are listening in, Gary and Joel do a wonderful musical performance together. Someday maybe we can air that for you. Gary plays the guitar and they sing together some of the poetry of Sue Pettit put to music that Gary has written. It's always been a wonderful part of the experience for participants. Bob, Martin, or Joe, might you wish to make a comment today? If you do, just raise your hand. And I will come to you, Bob. Okay, you're on. Hi, Bob.
I've joined this because I'm not a teacher or a principal or anything, but we run 3 principals discussion groups, and so any way you can learn to teach and share is extremely valuable. I've learned a tremendous amount from all of these sessions, but particularly today, this one was absolutely wonderful, and the stories and the ways of sharing metaphors and so forth have been wonderful. And I have there's a boy that he's 8 years old. He's struggling tremendously. He's in a school where he is the only white boy in the whole school. He gets picked on, and he is lives in the projects, and he's afraid to go out on the playground because, you know, he gets beaten up at times. He's only 8 years old, and yet he's such a wonderful little boy. We connected with him. He lived with my daughter for a while. He went from foster care to my daughter's house, and I just feel like I've really wanted to try and find some way to connect with him, with the principals, and also with his mother. His mother is a wonderful person, but has had all kinds of problems, PTSD, and she was on drugs for a long time and got off those, and she's doing the best she can, but it's just not working, and he's tending to be very violent. And I'm really concerned about them. But the things that I've learned today, I'm going to share this video with both his mother and him. And I think this could make a huge difference. You have no idea what kind of well, I shouldn't say that. You obviously know what kind of a difference this makes. But this is just so beautiful, and I just thank you for doing what you're doing. And I just wish everybody could experience this. But this particular webinar is going to get used more than just right now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
I want to just mention something too about what you just said there, Bob. You know, with that young man and being in a difficult situation, and you know, another benefit that is so impactful with the principles is the empathy that comes when you understand that we all are just kind of operating from our thinking. And it allows us to oftentimes to step out and not have to take things personally when we see bad behaviors, and just to realize that we're all kind of innocently just going at this from our thoughts, and sometimes we're doing the best we can because we don't really know how to access that light, because it's kind of, you know, our life circumstances have made it so easy for this to happen, and not to let our light come forth. But that's one of the things that I enjoy so much too about helping people know the principles, is that you become more empathic toward them and toward challenging behaviors, which we see so much of in school, and just realizing that it's coming from where that student's thinking is coming from. And it just helps us not to take things as personally. And maybe that same understanding would help this young man to not necessarily take some of that behavior that's happening around him as personally. And so thank you for mentioning that.
You know, the simple truth is that we are much more than our thinking. And when we take our thinking too seriously, it gets to be kind of a little trap like that cup. And there's a world of possibility. In St. Cloud, the two of you have been really important leaders in keeping the flame alive to bring the hope of the principles to people in school, community. That means families. You've done work with parents too. And it's the same for all folks, whether they're in professional positions, private individuals, students, grandparents. It works the same way. And we're about at that time where I would invite each of you, Joel and Brady and Sue, to make a closing comment. So maybe I'll just ask the three of you to collect your thoughts just briefly, and then whichever one of you wants to begin, please do that now.
I'm just going to, sorry, really quickly, because I'd rather hear from Joel and Brady. But I was thinking, you know, in terms of introductions, I don't think if I've been in with a class or a young person, and I've got a bit busy thinking about now which angle, how do I start talking about this thing? Because sometimes you feel that you haven't been invited. But I don't think it's ever failed in those situations if I say, would you be interested in learning something new?
Yes, yes.
And the children, of course, the cup's not being held down by their own hand quite so much. And I think that's a fabulous reminder of, yes, of course they want to know something new because they still believe in something new. And I think one of the difficulties is when you're with adults, they've got stronger beliefs about, well, what could there possibly be that's new given that we've got all this already? And so they're recycling. But I think, you know, I think it is going to be the young people that when there's enough young people and their voices get together, they're going to be the ones that show the rest of the world what's really new. But thank you very much. I've so enjoyed listening to you and everybody, of course.
Thank you, Sue. I know one of the things that educators always ask is, you know, well, how do you teach it? So we don't really have too much time to get into the hows, but, I think you find a context in whatever your role is in your school, in your situation. You find a context that works for you. For example, I've worked individually with students, maybe visiting with them once per week. I've done some small group with students, teaching once per week. I've done class presentations where myself and another person maybe go into a classroom, and maybe we take up like maybe 5 class sessions for maybe like 20 minutes each time, just to kind of introduce kids to principles. At one of my schools right now, we're doing a thing that we call quiet time, and we do it twice a day. Where I'm in a junior high school, so believe me, we need some quiet time. And so we come on the PA twice a day. First thing in the morning, usually right after things kind of get started with their advisories, and then right after all the lunch periods are finished, because those tend to be times when kids are really kind of over in chair 3 and 4 or more. And so we just, it's a quiet time where we kind of teach kids to slow down, to kind of calm their thoughts, and to focus on deep breathing, basically, as a way to calm and to kind of hit the reset button. But in that process, I have my turn on the PA on Thursdays. So on Thursdays I come in and I always try to sneak in some knowledge about the principles when I'm doing the quiet time, and I'll mention things like, letting go of thoughts that are causing you to feel discouraged or angry or upset or worried. Letting go of those can help you to access your wisdom and do your best. And so just within a short amount of time, the kids that are listening and tuning into that can kind of get a little bit of a refresher of what they can do to kind of get themselves to feel better and to do their best. And so, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways. Every building is different. People have different roles and so on, but you find a context that works for you, and you kind of try to embed it in there whenever you have an opportunity. So.
That's so true. I think this has really been a gift for me. Now that I've understood these principles for about 20 years, I think that what's so wonderful is how calm you can be in chaos. And whether I'm in Iraq or whether I'm in the middle of a fight situation downstairs with the students, when you can bring calm to a situation, or even to a student who's self-harming or looking to run away, when you can bring calm by pointing to their thinking and to their own innate health, what a gift! And it's a gift that I think is more than I could ever imagine. When I have a, it's interesting. There's a student I had about 15 years ago, and she, I just want to read something to you real quick here. She reached out to me. I haven't talked to her in probably 9 years. And she reached out to me the other day and she said, I've been thinking a lot of you about the last couple of days, about how I got where I am, and how I have you to thank for giving me the courage to believe in myself and the knowledge I needed to change my thinking and turn my life into a life I would love. You have had such a huge impact on me at such an important period in my life. Thank you so much. This was another girl that I only spent 3 or 4 hours with. This was one of those students that the teacher brought to me and said, Brady, I don't know how to help her. Can you spend some time with her? But it's been probably 15 years. She now has 4 children. She's in her 30s. And that's the gift, is that we never know, unless they reach out to us, we never know the impact. And I didn't do big counseling. I simply pointed her to her own health in the chaos that she went home to every day. She thought her life wasn't worth living, would never be happy, and now she absolutely loves it. And just a month ago was thinking about how she got where she is today with her 4 beautiful children. And she reaches out to me to go, you know what, I never in my wildest mind would have believed I would have been where I am today. And so what a gift we have that we're sharing with others.